name is Heather McGee, and this is the Happily Never After, a podcast that explores how life's endings can lead to a personal breakthrough. Because sometimes the end is just the beginning. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Happily Never After, a podcast where we explore how life's endings can lead to a new beginning. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to rate, review, and follow us wherever you are listening or watching the show today. Anna Bryant is a transracial adoptee from Iowa. She grew up in a multiracial household with white parents and international adoptee sisters from South Korea. She has been in reunion with her family of origin for 8 years, which has brought both joys and heartbreaks. She is currently working on her memoir, Cultural Fraud, which I have had the privilege to read a little bit of that, and it's really great, which explores her reunion journey and her search for Black identity. She currently resides in the Black Mecca of Atlanta with her husband and loves to travel, spend time with friends, and occasionally review new snacks, which is an activity I think we can all relate to. Anna, I'm so pleased to welcome you to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Heather. I'm excited to be here.
All right. Maybe we should start off. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, I'm originally from Bettendorf, Iowa. I grew up playing soccer, student council, like all of the activities, but was like eager to spread my wings and leave post high school. So I moved to Cleveland, Ohio, attended Case Western Reserve University and played soccer, studied engineering, and then moved to Atlanta, which was like a complete cultural shift based on how I grew up. And while I was in Atlanta and kind of just connecting with Black culture more, I really became curious about my biological family. Being the only Black person growing up in my family, I'd always been curious kind of like what my relatives looked like and just like, how my story really began, never knowing my origin. So I started that search in 2017, 2016. And have since connected with both sides of my biological family. And yeah, it's been wonderful kind of like expanding my family system. I always wanted a big family growing up, and now I have like a massive family with a lot of different branches. So it's been really cool, but also a lot of challenges. Like I think finding my origin story brought up a lot of kind of pain that I hadn't dealt with from just my adoption. And I think I'd always believed because I'd been adopted pretty young that I didn't really remember any of that, but a lot of that really stayed with me and kind of came out throughout that process. So, yeah, it's been a journey.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting in your writing, kind of the takeaway that I got from it is that as you aged, as you got older and started to go out into the world a little bit more, that it actually got more complicated than it was when you were younger. And it sounded like
For
from
sure.
learning. Something that I think is interesting is society positions adoption as a simple, happy ending, like
Yeah.
open and shut. But the reality is a lot more complicated. What would you like to say about that?
Yeah. I think it's super complex, as you said. I think growing up, I always felt like I was a foster child originally. My parents brought me home at 2 days old. So I've really always been with them. And I always felt like, well, I don't even remember any biological family. It's not like they adopted me at like 5 years old. So I really kind of bought into this like blank slate theory that I think a lot of people have about adoption, especially infant adoption. But I think like after years of therapy, kind of learning that your body remembers those things. And infancy and, the pregnancy process is such a deep connection of like that mother child bond. And having that broken actually leaves really long lasting results. And so I think what I found as I got older was I had a lot of grief actually about, that kind of separation. And it's grief that looking back, I think I always had, but I never knew. Like, I think I would have always said that I had like a really happy childhood. I loved how I grew up. I had lots of friends, played lots of sports. But as I've been writing my memoir, I've like revisited a lot of childhood diaries and just like school projects and like all of the relics of my past, and found that there's a lot of like sadness, like a lot of feeling like I didn't belong, a lot of feeling like I didn't know who I was, a lot of questions about my family and those things. I didn't really remember feeling those things. And I think as all of this grief came up, it really became clear that there was like this sad part of adoption that had never really been acknowledged that I needed to now like figure out as an adult, which has been challenging. But I think, like, for me, that's been, like, my biggest kind of mental health work.
Well, and It's interesting to hear you mention this because I've heard this quite a few times that writing memoir can be really challenging emotionally because you're going back to live, for it to be like a book that people would read, there need to be stakes and tension and all of those things.
Mhm.
But for the author who lived those things, it can be really, heavy.
Yeah, it's a lot to sift through and a lot of, like, confronting feelings and some feelings that I didn't know that I had, and I think that the time period of my memoir spans about 5 to 6 years. So the early parts were kind of easier to write because I've already kind of processed those things. But things like finding my biological family, finding my biological father in particular, having been more recent, was actually the hardest thing to write about because I'm still really sorting through those feelings and what it means to me and what our relationship has brought in my life. So it's definitely been challenging, but I think also rewarding. I've learned so much about myself, and I hope whenever it's finished that it brings some, like, comfort or sense of belonging to, like, other adoptees.
Yeah. Well, and what did your journey to reuniting with your birth family look like? How did you do that?
Ooh, Heather, this was so crazy. Mm. So
You're like, "Deep breath."
yeah. Um, so there are so many things, but I think, like, the biggest kind of pivot point for me was, like, the mid-2000s. There's a lot of police brutality going on, and it really kind of caused this reckoning for me of, like, what it means to be Black in America, and it created a lot of tension within my adoptive family because I just felt like my parents didn't really understand. I didn't really feel like my sisters, even though they're not white, they didn't really still understand, and I just felt really kind of isolated. And the 2016 election was kind of like the big pivot point for me where I was like, okay, I really need to find people that like understand what I'm feeling right now. And so I eventually, I think, yeah, early 2017, I asked my parents, if they could help me find my birth parents. And at the time, the state of Iowa, like, you would have to file a court order to make like, propose that you could get your adoption files. So it wasn't like, I think now you can just like request them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the laws have kind of changed, but I remember not really knowing how the process was gonna go, but I needed my birth certificate, which my parents had. So I asked them, and my mom was like, "Well, what do you wanna know?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know, that's kind of like a complex question." I was like, "I mean, I guess I wanna know, like, their names or something, to start
Let's
off
start
with."
with that.
Yeah. And, she was like, "Oh, well, we have a file," and, yeah, they had this file, which I didn't know about. I always thought I had, like, a closed adoption, so I didn't think my parents would have any, like, identifying information or anything. They had a file with, like, names. They had a photo of my birth mom. They had like health records, family history, and kind of the write up from the social worker about what had happened. So they had actually a lot of information. And it took a while of Googling and things before I was able to find anyone. Eventually, I think I found a obituary from another family member, like an aunt and uncle, and found that my mom had been married and changed her last name. So then I was able to find her, and we connected via email, but she mentioned that she had just gotten out of the hospital and she'd reached back out when she was feeling better, and she never reached back out. And like months later, I woke up one day with just like a really horrible feeling and I couldn't really place it. And, I was like, looking outside, is something going on? Or like I called my family, is like someone sick? Like everything seemed normal. And I still just had this really bad feeling. So I Googled her name and found that her funeral was happening like that morning at, like, that exact time, which was crazy. Yeah, so we didn't really get to connect, but I found out that I had a younger sister in her obituary, and I hadn't been able to find other family members on Facebook or anything, so I was able to connect with her a few months later, and then she really introduced me to more of, like, my maternal biological family, and then a few years later, one of my cousins helped me find my biological father. So it was kind of like a spider web of connections almost that kind of took a process over time. But yeah, now I know both sides of the family. I haven't met everybody, but have good relationships with people on both sides.
Now how does that feel to I mean, my interpretation from your writing, please, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's really fascinating that now you're in reunion with a much expanded family? Like your family has become so big and coming from different sides of your life and different parts of your life. How do you feel about that? Was that healing for you or was that challenging?
It was really challenging at first. I think with my maternal side of the family, it was a lot easier to manage because I met people kind of one at a time. So I met my younger sister, we really connected, and it was just the two of us for a really long time, just chatting. And then slowly I began to connect with other family members, but it was really kind of like that side of the family is a bit more distant. So there wasn't like a family reunion or like a moment to go meet everyone at once. It kind of happens like piecemeal and across a long time horizon. But then I met my father and it was like the complete opposite experience. So like we connected and things moved really quickly. Like he sent out an email blast to all his friends and family about I found my long lost daughter. And I was in his Christmas card that year, along with his new grandchild of like, look at these new family members. And people were hitting me up on Facebook and posting my long lost niece and all of these things, which was nice, but really overwhelming. And wow, so many people to connect with. And it's nice that you all want to connect, but also I need time to like process.
Yeah.
So it was a challenge, but I think what I've come to understand now as well is that every relationship has like looks different and I am not the same degree of closeness with like every relative and that's okay. I think that's normal in all families. So I think at first I felt a lot of pressure to like I don't know spend a lot of time connecting with every single person, which is just not really feasible. So I think finding the people that I connect more with and like, focusing my time I think has been better, kind of focusing on depth versus spreading myself really thin across everybody. So yeah, it's been a process. I would say now it has felt very healing, but at the time it was very jarring and very much like
Yeah.
caused a lot of chaos within me.
I can see how that would have been very overwhelming. Although I mean, it's kind of funny to hear you describe it now. It sounds like your dad would have like hired a
Really
plane
looking
with
out.
a banner if he could have.
No, honestly. I mean, it's nice that he was so proud.
Yeah, that
I feel
is
like it
nice.
could go a number of different ways, and honestly, it's scary to not really know how you're gonna be received. I was nervous about just, like, making contact. What if he didn't even wanna speak to me? What if he denied that I was his? Or just, like, you don't really know how it's gonna go. So the fact that I was received with such warmth and care, even though it was overwhelming, was that part was really healing.
Now, something you talked about, when it comes to adoption, there's an aspect to it that can really separate you from pieces of your identity. And you talk about in your writing that you didn't know that you were a Black woman until the age of 21. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I do wanna say people always I think this is, like, I don't know, one of those things that you say as, like, a writer and people are like, "What?" Like, I understood that I had black skin. I had
Yes.
a mirror, and I understood I was black. But I think growing up in Iowa
You're like, I have eyes.
yeah, growing up in Iowa, we had one family in our neighborhood that was black. There might have been, like, 2 other kids in my grade that were black. I did this family in our neighborhood, the mom was an AKA, she was in a black sorority, and they had this, like, beauty contest for little black girls called, like, Little Miss Fashionetta, which I did when I was, like, 7. And so they had these little activities before the pageant, like an etiquette class, we had, like, a sleepover, and I just remember going to the sleepover and, like, being really excited, like, these girls didn't go to my school, they're kind of from all over our area, I'm gonna, like, make new friends, and I just felt so, so different from them. Like, I didn't they would have little songs that I didn't know, there was movies that we would watch at night that I we were just very interested in different things, and I just felt so much that, like, I didn't belong, and I think looking at school, the few black classmates that I did have, I felt pretty different from. And so I think I just internalized kind of like, okay, well, I am black, but I must not like really be black in a cultural sense.
Yeah.
And I think too, other people would say that too, you're not really black, white kids in my school and black kids. And you start to internalize that. And I think going to college definitely helped. I met more black people that I had things in common with, like other black nerds, I guess. Yeah, but I think the Trayvon Martin, murder was really a wake-up call for me, and I remember I found out from, like, friends. We had been walking to a gas station at night around campus to get some snacks or, I don't know, drinks or something, and we were coming back, someone told my friend to put his hood down because of like what happened with Trayvon. And I wasn't really familiar with the story and they kind of told me what was happening. And I just thought it was so crazy that someone that's not doing anything wrong could just be killed for no reason. And the next summer I followed that case every day. I was working in sales at the time, so I was driving a lot. So I would listen to the trial on like CNN radio and like XM. And I would like watch all the coverage every night and like just remember being so heartbroken when George Zimmerman was let off. And I also remember seeing friends on like Facebook and stuff from college that weren't Black that like didn't sympathize at all and were and felt like it was right that George Zimmerman got let off. And I talked to my parents and they weren't aware of like what was going on with the trial. And it was just like this very isolating moment. And honestly, it was kind of scary of just like understanding how little Black lives are mattered in our country.
Yeah.
And so that was just like a bit of a wake up call for me. And I think I had always felt like I was somehow removed from that risk, especially growing up in a small town with white parents where everyone, like, I had two older sisters. So, like, by the time I was coming through school, everyone kind of knew that, like, we're the family with like adopted kids. And like, I never really had to explain that. And so, like, understanding that
Yeah.
now that I live somewhere
I feel
else.
that.
Yeah, I'm sure with your family as well. Now that I live somewhere else and, people don't know me as just like Pam and Larry's daughter, they see me first as a Black woman and like, what does that really mean? That was just something that I had to figure out really on my own. Like my parents never gave me the talk when I was a kid about how to be safe as a Black person in the world. And it's kind of ironic now with everything happening in Minneapolis. I see a lot of, white moms online talking about how they don't feel safe, sending their kids out in the world and the conversations they need to have. And like those are things that have happened in the Black community for forever.
Yeah.
And I think not having anybody ever teach me those things was a little frightening when I realized really that I'm at risk, in the world just by who I am. So that was a big awakening for me and I realized what it means, even if I haven't seen the movies or like know all the songs, like I'm still a Black woman and like, I had to figure out what that meant.
Yeah. Well, and related to this, you've talked about the importance that Atlanta has played in your life. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Atlanta is just like a special place. I think when I moved here, I had never been. I didn't ever yeah, I had never really been on my radar. I actually really wanted to live in Chicago after college. But I got this job in sales and I did this sales training program for like 6 months and then they place you anywhere in the country. And I was kind of like, Chicago's my number one, but honestly, I'll go anywhere. And my boss at the time that managed the program, she was just like, I think you're really going to love Atlanta. It was like a white woman too. She was just like, I think Atlanta is your city. And I was like, okay,
Hmm.
cool. Like, I'll go there. And I think for me, it's living here has taught me that Black people aren't a monolith. There is a healthy Black middle class. There are Black nerds, Black artists, Black executives. There is every type of Blackness that you could imagine in Atlanta. And for me, that was amazing because in Iowa, I feel like there was not that range. And even in Cleveland to some extent, like definitely more diverse, but I think still a small city, So I think coming to Atlanta has been amazing. And I think I've created my own kind of Black family here from friends from that I've met through the National Society of Black Engineers, through business school. So yeah, this is definitely home. I met my husband here. So yeah, it's just I feel like this is the place where I kind of found myself.
Now, I've never been to Atlanta, but it has been on my list as a place to visit.
Girl,
And
you
it
gotta
was
come
neat to
visit.
Yeah, it seems great. Now, something I think is really interesting now as an adult, you are very involved with connecting with other adoptees. Can you kind of talk about how did it feel to start to connect with other adoptees who may have had some similar experiences to you?
Connecting with adoptees has been really amazing because I think there's so many things that as an adoptee can be really difficult to explain. And I found that like people kind of get it immediately. After George Floyd, I happened to be home in Iowa when that happened. And it was really difficult to be feeling so much about his death and also feeling like seeing that my parents weren't feeling as much and feeling I needed to put on this kind of face because they just aren't aware of kind of everything that's going on emotionally for me. And at the time, I connected randomly with another Black adoptee on Twitter, and he and I were going back and forth. And that was kind of my first time talking to another Black adoptee that had been adopted by a white family and just talking about kind of the isolation you can have in moments like that. And it was really powerful to just know that I'm like not alone. Since then, I've joined a few like adoptee networks. I've done Adoptee Voices, which is like a writing cohort. They have several cohorts throughout the year. And that has been really powerful, just hearing people put to words these emotions that can feel so complex and so difficult. And yeah, having a bit of a voice about kind of your experience and kind of finding community in that way. And then this past year, I actually had the chance to go to the Black Adoptee meetup, which was in Chicago. So they go to a different city every year. Um, but it was just really nice to connect with people that understand your experience, have been through similar things. And like I said, there's a time people were asking at the meetup, what's your adoption story? Have you met your biological family? How is it? And I kind of hesitated because it's very complex. It's great on one side, but kind of challenging on others. And before I said anything, they're like, don't even, I know exactly what that pause means. And that kind of just understanding is really rare to find in other spaces, which I think is really special in the adoptee community.
Yeah, and it's making me think about I've come to a place where I feel like it's impossible for healing to happen in isolation. Like, I know when I
Yeah.
started connecting with other people who've had experiences like me, it made me feel like less of a weirdo. There's
Yes,
other people that've been
exactly.
through it, like, I put it that plainly, it's like I felt like a total weirdo,
Yeah.
but it turns out there are other people that have had similar experiences, and I really think finding community in that way can be really helpful in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you said it perfectly. It's amazing.
It's like still a weirdo, but, a weirdo with friends.
But I'm not a weirdo that's alone. Yeah.
You're
There's a
right.
bunch of us out here.
Yes. So what role did your, adoptive parents play in this journey? How has your relationship with your adoptive parents changed through all that?
Good question. I think that it's definitely changed. I think I've had to accept maybe the limitations of my parents. Like I think when I first started the journey of like wanting to find my biological family and feeling kind of alone in my family, I felt a lot of anger that they had not really considered that they were adopting a Black child. I think my parents will say, we love all of our daughters equally. And they have like a colorblind approach, which I think is probably typical for people that adopted in the early 90s, late 80s. I think that's kind of like what people would have advised. And for me, I found that to be really hurtful as I was getting older because I am a Black woman. I do have different experiences than my Korean sisters. And I had a lot of anger towards them about that. But I think now I've kind of come to the point of, I think there's a lot of discourse right now about like going no contact with your family.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think for me, I didn't feel like that was an option that I wanted. And so instead, I feel like I've had to come to accept that, like, my parents are who they are. This is what they can offer. And like an understanding of my Black experience may not be part of that. But that's okay because I can get that from friends, from other family members, and our relationship can be what it is. So I think I've kind of come to that acceptance. My parents, I wouldn't say they've been really involved on the journey. I wouldn't say they have been negative about it in any way, but I think they kind of view it as like, this is my journey to have. And like they respect that. And yeah, I think it was interesting. I got married in 2024, and that was the first time that they met a lot of my biological family. So I think that was interesting for them. A lot of my family was excited to meet them, but I think they are kind of like, I think they're like, oh, it was nice to meet them, but like that's your family. So like,
Mhm.
yeah. So I don't think they have, I think for them it's also emotional. I think especially my biological father, I think my mom really harbored some feelings about, like he didn't want you and like I'm never going to like him because of that. But she
Right.
was but I know that like that relationship is important to you and like we'll be cordial when we see him, but like that's for you to explore. So I think that's really more of their attitude, which I think is fine. Like it kind of leads to a degree of separation, but I think it's better than them being kind of outwardly against it or anything. But I think it's definitely been a transition period. My sisters have sometimes expressed, oh, hearing you call your other family sisters just can feel weird sometimes. But like I think we've
Mm,
evolved past that now. It's been quite a few years. And I think for me, it's like adding more family into my life doesn't diminish the role of, the family I grew up with. I think there's room in my life for everyone. And I think it took my family a bit to maybe understand that, but I think we're there now.
right. Do
Yeah.
so this is a show that's all about endings, endings and
Mhm.
beginnings, and adoption is full of many endings and many beginnings, sometimes all at the
Yeah.
same time. What are some of the lessons or big things that you have taken away from all of these endings and beginnings in your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think especially the reunion piece, I thought that that was gonna feel like a happily ever after moment, like the high that I was on after I met my father was like insane. But I think also
With the airplane and the banner, basically.
yeah, exactly, it was very much like a huge honeymoon phase, like it was like falling in love or something. And I think there have definitely been challenges. My father and I went a year without speaking because there's just a I needed a break. So I think being open to the reunion not going maybe the way that you hope or maybe not being perfect. We've reconciled now, which is really nice, but like there's been a lot of ups and downs, and, like, I thought finding my family was gonna be, like, yeah, the happy ending, but there's a whole 'nother journey after that reunion point of, okay, now that we're in reunion, what does our relationship actually look like? And now that the honeymoon phase is over, where do we go from here, and how do we interact, and how do we, intertwine these lives that have been so separate for so long is kind of a lot to figure out, and, yeah, we're still figuring that out.
I think, with social media, because you said something earlier that was I very much recognize talking about adoption in the early 90s and late 80s.
Mhm.
And I kind of think I've been thinking about this lately that social media, I think, has served to some of these things that were kind of in the dark as they're bringing it into the light. So people that are
Yeah.
adopting now, I feel like people maybe know a little bit more than they did back
Yeah.
then. For anyone out there that is maybe considering adoption or in the middle of it, or maybe they're already an adoptive parent, and then also adoptees that are going through the process you are, is there any big advice you would want people to consider, whether they're a parent, potential parent, or an adoptee?
Yeah, I mean, I think for both, recognizing and acknowledging that there is, like, trauma involved in adoption in addition to, like, this love and joy, there's also a really deep pain and loss for the adoptee, and, I can't speak for all adoptees, but I think in general, society kind of glosses over that loss aspect of it. And I think specifically for transracial parents that are considering like transracial adoption, having like a cultural understanding of what your child is going to experience, I think is really important. My family, we had a lot of support for my sisters. There's, like, Korean adoptee support group in our town. My sisters went to this, like, culture camp every summer, and there was a lot of work done to kind of acknowledge their heritage, and I think because I was born in Iowa and an American, it wasn't felt like Blackness distinctly has its own culture, but I think, especially now, like, I think understanding the world that experiencing how your child is gonna experience the world or acknowledging how your child is gonna experience the world is really important and, like, preparing them for that. Yeah. So I think it's important for, I guess, for adoptive parents, if they're gonna adopt outside of the race, to be aware, to build relationships with people in that community so that your child doesn't grow up kind of alone, I think is important. Yeah, and I think just to acknowledge that loss and, like, help talk through that. I think my therapist specializes in adoptees, and she always says, like, the right time to talk about adoption with your child is when they start asking, um, and, they may need help to figure that stuff out as well. So I think just being open to that.
Yeah, I mean, you're making me think about, I have 4 Black brothers,
Mhm.
and I think the experience they had is very similar to yours. They had no connection to
Mm.
Black culture. Their entire surroundings were, I don't think they knew any other Black kids at all because
Yeah.
their surroundings were completely white. And I think as we have grown up and looking back on that, I really wish we would have helped them connect to their culture because
Yeah.
they didn't have that at all. And I think they had a very similar experience to you when they grew up and just felt like a fish out of water because they'd never experienced that before.
Yeah, it's funny, I feel like there's not a lot of adoption stories are really common in, like, media, but there's not a lot from the
Yeah.
adoptees perspective, and, like,
Yeah.
as funny as it sounds, This Is Us was, like, a really transformative show for me, like, seeing kind of Randall's perspective, and, it's funny, a lot of people reach out and be like, "Oh my god, have you seen this? Does this, like, hit home for you?" And, like, that was really the time I was finding my biological family too, so it really did, but I think adoptees also need to hear more adoptee stories. I'm curious
Yeah.
how it is for you, like, knowing that your brothers might have experienced that, like, have you guys ever talked about it?
No, we haven't. I think a lot of us have a lot of sadness because I think it's one of those things where you grow up and you see things completely differently and
Yeah,
it's like, well, that wasn't right. You know, like,
yeah,
because I grew up evangelical fundamentalist and there are a lot
mhm,
of practices when it comes to adoption that are very normal in evangelical
mhm.
circles. But as a grown up looking back, I mean, there's a lot of problems with being evangelical, but specifically this looking, but like things like, they always change the child's name no matter how old they were. Like they
Mm,
got a new name
yeah,
and they like use the Bible to rationalize it. But now looking back, it's like they had a name. Why do they need a new name?
yeah,
They had a name, especially for adoptees that were 12, 13, 14, older. They had a
yeah,
whole life before they came here. And I know, so now as an adult, I would say the primary thing is I feel a lot of sadness. I
yeah,
wish that, I love my siblings so much and we have a good relationship, but I think we all acknowledge that that was not the right way
yeah,
for this to happen. And we were all kids. So, kids are kind of
yeah,
dumb and don't know much growing up. But like as an adult now looking back, I don't think that was right, and I think it led
yeah,
to what you're talking about. At church, they talk about adoption is so perfect and wonderful, and while it is
mhm,
great, it's complicated. They're going
yeah,
through an ending, and it just erases their experience because so many people
yes,
focus on
exactly.
the adoptive parents and not what the adoptee is going through, which I think is more important.
Yeah, no, 1,000%. And I think that erasure is what can be really tough about being an adoptee. I think oftentimes when people find out I'm adopted, the reaction is like, "Oh my gosh, like your parents must be such great people," and like, "Wow, that's so great of them," which just is gonna rub any adoptee the wrong way. But yeah, I think people often think about, the story of the parents not being able to conceive or whatever their reasons may be, or maybe they must be so charitable. Yeah, it is very not adoptee centered. And I think we would love to see more adoptee stories in that way. And I think
Yeah,
it's also crazy. I think it's just an interesting experience as an adult to look back at how you're raised, regardless of kind of what your story is, and like see things so differently. And like as an adoptee, there's this, I'm not sure you've heard this phase of like coming out of the fog. And like I think that this whole experience of like finding my biological family, kind of finding my Black identity is like, wow, I really was in such a different headspace back then, and I see things a little more clearly, like all of this grief that I maybe just missed as a kid because I felt like I needed to be grateful and happy and like, not lose all of the things that have been afforded me. So it's just yeah, I think it's an interesting experience. I think I'm grateful for the memoir writing process as well because I think I've learned and recognized a lot of things that I maybe wouldn't have.
yeah, I'm positive you're familiar with Angela Tucker. She has a
Yeah.
phrase that says, "You should be grateful," which I think
Yeah.
really sums a lot of this up.
Mhm. For
And I
sure.
would say I will add on based on our conversation because yeah, we had that all the time. Like I remember people used to say to my parents, and even then, back when we knew nothing, we knew enough that this was wrong. They would say things like, "Wow, your parents must be saints," or "Your parents are saints," and
Yeah.
my parents always corrected them immediately. And so I would say that to anyone out there, if you meet someone where you're talking about adoption, please don't say something like that because it's incredibly
Yeah.
offensive to everyone involved. So don't do that.
Yeah.
Like, just
1,000%.
don't. And I do think through all that, I feel like social media is used for so much bad stuff, right? But I do
Mhm.
think a lot of times issues like this, I don't know that they're as possible now that we have an open internet and social media. And yes, there's a lot bad with it, but you also have access to a lot more information
For
where I think
sure.
some of these things that maybe when we were younger, before the internet, I don't think it would have happened, because we would have seen it online and been like, maybe we would have handled things better. You have so much more information.
For sure. And I think it's easier than ever to connect with people that have had a similar experience, like all of the adoption groups that I'm a part of, I found through social media. And I feel like also just if people are curious, I think like pages like the Black Adoptee, Adoption Mosaic, like I feel like sites like those also share a lot of educational content about like things that may not be comfortable for adoptees. And there are also tons of like webinars and things that maybe for a mixed group, like prospective adoptive parents and things that I think I would encourage anyone that's interested in adoption to really seek out adoptee groups to learn more about what the adoptee's experience may be like.
As we're wrapping up, I have a big question for you that I always ask people that come on the show. Sometimes people have silly answers and sometimes they're pretty profound. You've had so many experiences in your life. In life, what do you know for sure?
This is a hard one.
It's a big question.
I was like, when you sent the questions, I was kind of like, do I know anything for sure? I don't
You're
know.
like, nothing.
But it's interesting. I think the one thing I do know for sure is like as much as my adoptive family and biological family has been a journey and is very complex, it's also one that I did not choose for better or for worse. And I think what I do know is like getting married was a very profound experience for me because it was like a family that I actually got to choose. And we're actually expecting a baby girl in June. So, yeah, so we're very
That's so
excited.
exciting.
Yes. But I think what I know for sure is that like I've spent a long time seeking my place and I know for sure now that I've found my place and that is the creation of my own family. You asked earlier about like what name did I prefer and like uh, changing your name as a woman can be controversial, but for me, it was like taking the Bryant name was like the first name that I got to choose for myself. And I think as an adoptee, for me, that was really special and meaningful. And yeah, I think what I know for sure is that even though I felt like I might never find my place, I do feel like I found it. And I do think it's possible for those that feel like they may never belong to find somewhere you do.
I want to thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your story, which I know can be, these are very vulnerable stories. Anyone that comes on the show to talk about their story, I have so much respect and appreciation for the willingness to do that. So thank you for being here today. Where can people find you if they want to work with you or hear more from you or get to know you better?
Thanks so much for having me, Heather. This was really nice. Yeah, I really appreciate reaching out. If you want to find me, you can find me on Instagram or Threads at AnnaB_living.
Awesome. And I'm going to put that in the show notes. So nobody has to like scribble, frantically to write this down. I'm going to put it in the show notes so you can go there and access that very easily. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to everyone who's listening today. Yes, especially those of you that are on your own journey. We hope you have a great week.